to our webinar. It's about happy and healthy habitats with Paula Diaz. My name is Brooke Widmar and I work for the Missouri Prairie Foundation. And I want to thank you all for joining us for this Grow Native webinar. Make sure to join us next week for the last event of our fall series. It's a masterclass on grassland invasive plant management with Jared Hubner. For today's webinar, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A or chat section. And when Paula is done presenting, Carol will ask her your questions. This presentation is being recorded, and tomorrow you'll receive an email with the YouTube link and other resources mentioned in today's session. Quick note, if you're a landscape architect and need professional development hours, this webinar can count as a half credit, and next week's webinar is 1 credit. I do want to take a moment and recognize our 2020 Grow Native sponsors. They're listed here on your screen, and their contributions support our program and programs like this. So now to introduce today's speaker, Paula Diaz. She's the principal of GardeNerd Consultations. She helps to incorporate native plants into traditional home and business landscapes. Paula is a master gardener and a master communicator, publishing articles, teaching classes, and giving talks about native plants. Her passion is to create spaces which are ecologically beneficial and to share with others the joy of welcoming nature into home spaces and to human spaces. So without further ado, take it away, Paula.
Okay, so is my mic on, Brooke? Give me a thumbs up. Okay, good. There's always got to be something to get us going so we can laugh. That makes it a happy habitat, right? So I just want to let y'all know that I have a really hard time with not being able to see the faces for feedback, but I will do my absolute best here. So first thing I want to talk about, if we're going to have a happy, healthy habitat, the absolute number one thing, even before we start putting our plants in, is stop using the chemicals on our gardens and our lawns. I have so many people who say, well, I want to plant a pollinator garden, but my husband sprays the lawn. I'm sorry, folks, it's always that Y chromosome that has the connection to turf grass. I don't know what it is, but science needs to examine that. But anyway, it's my husband insists on no weeds and whatever. And so one of the things that we have to talk about is make sure your place where you're planting the plant is safe, but also make sure that the plant itself is safe as far as how it was grown before it gets delivered to you, that it hasn't had chemicals used on it that will kill the creatures that you're attracting with it. So I kind of wanted to talk about our perspective on a happy, healthy habitat, much more so than the science of it today. So this is a book that I had when I was a little tot, and I've been reading it to my granddaughter. And the other day when I was, contemplating all these things, I'm always watching for something that I can hook onto. But I noticed in these illustrations, and yes, this was my older brothers and sisters, so I'm not as old as this book, but look at these illustrations. They expected to have dandelions in their yard. They expected to have rabbits and birds and butterflies. And as the cover shows, spiders and spider webs. And this home in this little storybook, it wasn't some out in the country thing. It's close enough into town that there was a kid throwing the newspaper and there was the milkman delivering the bottled milk. This was suburbia. So in such a short amount of time, we have gone from things like that were acceptable to there better be nothing but fescue or Kentucky bluegrass, maybe some zoysia or Bermuda grass in our lawns. When I was a kid, I made chains out of the clovers, and we used to eat those little tiny yellow sour flowers. Remember that? And the violets, we would pick them and take them into mom as a bouquet. When did violets become a weed that we should kill? When things were earlier in our history of civilization, violets were cultivated in greenhouses as being a wonderful, beautiful gift for someone, or a wonderful, beautiful thing to attire our fine china with. But somehow this mentality has come that things that are beautiful in our lawn are no longer allowed. It has to be just plain old lawn. And one of the things I really try to focus on in my personal interactions regarding native plantings and our healthy, happy habitats is we have to start with the children. I used to do substitute teaching. If there was a bug in the classroom, oh my goodness, the kids literally freaked out. They were climbing on their chairs to get away from it, wanting to kill it. This happens to be my granddaughter. One morning she kept going over to the front window and I couldn't figure out what she wanted. So I was like, okay, she wants to go outside and play. So we went outside. No, she had seen this moth fluttering against the glass. And she notices things like that because I point them out to her. So if we teach our children that other creatures like moths are not bad things, they'll come to appreciate them. This is her pointing at a monarch on the liatris there. And she notices these things everywhere. So we've got to start with the kids. And then we need to start here. So this is a very, very traditional landscaping that within the last, 40 years or so, this has become what we should have. We should have these low growing green things and trees that were planted incorrectly. So they're sprouting all kinds of sprouts at the bottom and lots of mulch. And it should be black so that it holds in all the heat and nothing but turf grass in our lawns. And then in the back, it can look like this, just this big ocean of green, which I love the color green, but I'd rather have multiple colors of green, and I'm a flower fiend. So, we got to have flowers too. This particular berm is from a client who had their patio installed with pavers. And so there was some excavation done. And she had this soil put at the back of the property so that they could, she thought, just, create a little bit of privacy without having to put up a fence. So she had planted the birch that you see on the right and the 3 evergreens, which died quickly thereafter because they were never watered. And evergreens don't really love this area unless they're really, really in exactly the right spot and have enough moisture. So if we're looking at happy and healthy, she has little kids. I convinced her to kind of turn a little more organically management of the turf. And we planted a monarch way station on that berm. And this particular monarch caterpillar is one that was right there next to that sign on the berm. And it's an enclosed space. So is it messy? Yes, it absolutely is. But is it healthy? Yes, it absolutely is. So we don't have to have the whole entire yard be this type of installation. But even in an association such as hers, she has many people not complain, but rather question and compliment regarding this bountiful little berm that she has now. And there's always flowers blooming and there's always insects on it. This is another one that we find this to be an acceptable type of landscaping. Is it kind of neat and tidy? Yeah, it's pretty neat and tidy because there's really nothing there but grass and 1 tree in the front. So neat and tidy, yeah, but what about if we made 2 big giant beds that are lined with really nice stonework? And inside those beds, those plants are contained so that they're not going to ravage all the other neighbors or anything. They're not going to break out of their boundaries and escape the jail, except maybe by seeds, but we don't mention that. But something like this brings all kinds of life into very traditional areas. We don't have to think of, I have to have enough space to have a prairie, which God knows I would love, but not everyone wants that kind of management. These folks are constantly taking photographs of all the different insects and wanting new plants added, and they love their space and they love all the life that it has now. This is one, again, very, very traditional landscaping, but they got to where they really hated looking at it. It was just boring to them. It didn't really have anything this lady's phrase that she loves is go big or go home. So she wanted to rip out every single thing and put in natives because she lives in Johnson County, Kansas, and they offer cost share rebates to their residents under a program called Contain the Rain, if you happen to be in that area. So she wanted to just like rip everything out. Well, of course I said, yes, the burning bush has to go. That's going to go. And forsythia, I think, is evil. I have a hedgerow that's filled with it that when my husband retires, then we can attack things together in that area. But, you know, until then, I deal with it. But so forsythia and burning bush were, yes, absolutely had to go. But if you can see up here, there's a nice little sitting area, and I was really afraid they would feel very exposed to the neighbors if everything was gone. So we kept one of the hollies, and the other stuff went away. And this is a photo that she sent to me because her son, the younger son, loves getting out and enjoying the insects. He's always intrigued. He's really a smart little guy. I have so much fun with him. But he really is learning about how some of these plants are edible for humans and how some of the things that would be sprayed and killed in our yard are edible for humans. And then the pollinators on here, they had monarch caterpillars the very first season that they had these things in place. I mean, there's nowhere else for these creatures to eat. If you looked at the whole neighborhood, the adult creatures might get some nectar, but otherwise they're probably not going to find a whole lot of food. So again, you can take what is a very traditional structure. She had some herbicide damage to boxwoods that were right here. All the other boxwoods are still in place, but I think she's pretty close to wanting to get rid of those too. They smell atrocious in July when you're sitting on that patio or working on that patio. Oh my gosh, the smell is stomach churning, really and truly. But is this really absolutely what we would really think of as neat and tidy, even though they're all shaved into balls and all lined up in a row? Is this so much worse when we can see that there are creatures coming and utilizing it? It's contained within the concrete and the stone wall. It's something that they're really learning they like. Here's another one that this is all done with traditional landscaping. This person had requested a local well-known nursery to put in for them a pollinator garden. Well, I'm not sure that whoever designed this really knew a whole lot about pollinators. So they put in some things that they had at the nursery, and maybe they had a tag on them, but really he didn't see much activity by pollinators. And a lot of what they put in was not anything that any pollinator would look at. So they weren't really happy with that. But if you look at this, just on that whole neat and tidy scale, which is so often what native plants are judged as untidy, when we're thinking about using them in traditional landscapes, is this really all that neat and tidy right here? Or could something like this, which also has stepping stones going through it and a bench for seating and pathways of grass, as you can see, there's some of the traditional elements still up here against the deck. And these are all very confined within their little areas that they've been allowed. This homeowner loves to sit on this little bench back in the corner. She wanted to have privacy from her neighbor, and that height of some of the plants that were used in there gave her the privacy she wanted. And she's constantly enjoying the pollinators, the birds. That's the next step up from why we plant the native plants is for the pollinators. Those pollinators are a food source for the birds and the other creatures. So that's where we go when we're talking about using plants like this instead of plants like this. And really, it's not a whole lot different in the look that it gives. This was, again, Johnson County, Kansas, a very nicely appointed neighborhood, a beautiful home. This landscaping, not so beautiful in my opinion. I mean, not only is it totally sterile and devoid of life, it's really not that aesthetically pleasing to me anyway. So instead, they have an area that was chained off. You can see this little wooden fence. The client has 2 medium-sized dogs that love to explore and investigate everything that we do. But she really has loved having the life that she can look out from her screen porch. She can look out from the window in the living room and really enjoy the life, even when she's not outside. The flowers, of course, are always fun to have. You can make bouquets. And that's one thing I always encourage people to do. Go to the thrift store or garage sale, dig in your bottom drawer, whatever, find some old vases or something cute or whatever. I go to the thrift store personally and I go buy vases and give away bouquets as my plants are blooming. Anybody that just needs a lift in their day, I think it's kind of fun for them. And in addition to that, it helps people to see the native plants and their blooms as something of beauty and of consequence, instead of only as that word weeds that we have been using on these plants for so long. They're gorgeous. They changed it from butterfly weed to butterfly flower, and then people bought it. So what's the deal? Sometimes folks learn about monarchs, which, as we've had that phrase put out there that I've stolen, they are the gateway bug, which was absolutely true for me. I learned about monarchs, started planting milkweed. That was where my whole dive into the ocean of native plant world came from. But I kind of sometimes wonder about, what if we did kind of a mullet idea here, where in the front, we can be all traditional boxwood hedges, lots and lots of mulch, lots and lots of turf grass. But maybe in the back, we could do one bed where we've included even some tiny boxwoods that will nourish the pollinators. And then maybe we get an idea that, well, maybe that other space over there, we could put something in there too. So even though this fronts to a golf course, if you can see back here, and it's a very well-to-do area, it's very, very, very traditionally landscaped on all the other spaces of the house. This particular spot was actually where the sump pump drains out, so they weren't having success with turf grass there anyway. So we put in some marsh milkweed, some other things. So there will be actually creatures who can utilize that. Now, Carol just told me as we were talking, getting this all started, that boxwoods do offer more than just shelter. She said that Alan Branhagen, I feel like we should all genuflect when we say that name, that Alan had told her that boxwoods, when they bloom in the spring, are actually a really great early source of pollen and nectar for those really teeny tiny early bees. But maybe we can have our total traditional look and then sneak in one bed where we let things be a little bit different and even put a sign on it that tells us about it. Here's another one. This is one that was just recently planted. And as we all know, one of the hardest things about native plant love is patience, because we have to wait for those plants to mature. I know for me, patience is not in a great deal of supply. It's as scarce as toilet paper. But if we can perhaps put a cover crop, I bought some seeds of zinnias and threw them in there. Nothing else was done as far as work. I literally threw the zinnia seeds in there. So they had all kinds of nectar available for the adult creatures, while the baby plants underneath were really getting going. It didn't look like an empty, sparse space because it was full of life and color. And again, bouquets, bring those flowers inside so we can enjoy them there too. This particular home, as you can see, is a very stately home, very beautiful, very nice neighborhood. You can see that everybody's got the little trimmed boxwoods and stuff. So it's very typical neighborhood. However, it's also a very open-minded neighborhood. This particular tree needed to come out. which opened up all kinds of sunshine here for this person to utilize. And their determination was that they wanted a full-on prairie look. They did not want beds. They did not want swaths of the same plant planted. They wanted the full effect of a prairie in their front yard. No mullet here, it's all down on everything. Again, zinnias were used as a cover crop, so it's attractive to the neighborhood. This, even though it's kind of hard to see, this was taken later in the year and it wasn't being watered, but there is turf grass. Some sod was laid as a border, so it is framed with a border. But the amount of life in this area in just that first spring through summer, it was incredible to see. It really was just, I was in awe when I went to check on it, and I saw hummingbirds, and I can't tell you how many different species of butterflies all flitting through there. Not everybody can do this, but there's a lot of young children that are out in the street playing and out on the sidewalks playing. They've got some signage from MPF posted to explain to folks that this is a process that they're going through to create this habitat. And what I've always said is share the flowers, share the caterpillars. Kids aren't going to get to go in the classroom to raise a caterpillar in the classroom right now. So when you've got caterpillars in there, point them out to the children, let them see them, ask the parents if they'd like to try to raise them. Sometimes it doesn't work out when they're novices, but if that one poor little caterpillar suffers an untimely end, but then teaches those children and their parents and their grandparents and their aunts and uncles and whoever else gets to hear the story of it, that if you plant the right plants, we can support this whole population, then maybe that one little guy is worth it, even if he doesn't make it. But it was a beautiful spot. The second hardest thing I find about native plant planting is, first comes the patience, that's hard. Next is don't overthink things. And so leaving the leaves. Again, my beautiful and adorable and wonderful granddaughter, she loves playing in the leaves. It's something that I think back to when I was a kid, and I can remember when we would go trick-or-treating and you're tromping through the leaves on the sidewalks as you go. And it's a sound that is from our past, but we've kind of forgotten it, because in so many neighborhoods, that sound of crunch, crunch, crunch under our feet has become instead the sound of leaf blowers blowing. And this sound, to my opinion, is much more pleasant and much more fun. I mean, look at this girl. You can see there's plenty of space here that this dog could have chosen anywhere to lie down. He's not, in fact, the smartest creature that God ever created, but he chose this big blob of leaves that happens to collect right in that spot. And whether it was comfy or scratching his itch, I don't know, but that's where he chooses to lie down, is in those big, deep piles of leaves. And isn't it interesting that there's still green grass right here? And there's lots and lots and lots and lots of leaves, but this tells you that green grass grows here, even though all those leaves stay there. A lot of people tell me that, well, I mulch my leaves, so that way it goes back into the soil, or I rake them all up and I put them into the compost heap or put them on my garden beds. Those are all a step up, and bravo. But something you might want to consider is, if you're mulching those leaves, would you particularly spot this little guy and say, oh, I better not mulch right there and chop that guy up? Or any of these others, would you know when you saw these once they fell to the ground that those shouldn't be mulched up? Or maybe if you're raking them up, that might even disturb them too. And maybe some of these will stay attached to the branches and such, and that's a great thing too. But sometimes we got to figure out that the leaves are okay. They're not a bad thing. They're not going to harm anything. Another thing that folks are really, really ingrained in our brains to do is to clean up our gardens. Well, I have so many other things I'd rather be doing than that. I kind of like Mother Nature doing the work. These are two photos. The photo it's on my left, so I hope that's also your left. That's the one with the verbiage above it. Was taken by Nadia Navarrete Tyndall or her husband, Randy. It doesn't say, so one of them, but she posted it. And what this shows is on that plant material that stays standing, here is a gall, and you can see the hole in the center. So you know that that gall was containing creatures that were consumed by a downy woodpecker. This photo was taken by Mary Nemesek, who is a wonderful proponent of all things natural. And she found this actually consuming the little insects out of the gall. So if we leave those branches and twigs and such standing, and we don't worry so much about, well, what is that thing? Maybe I should kill it. It might have something bad in it. Sometimes we just have to let things run their course. Again, patience. See what happens. If it was something horrible, deal with it in the springtime. If not, let somebody else eat it. Because even if it wasn't supposed to be there, somebody else might be able to eat it. And I've never understood, this is me being weird with native plants again, but I've never understood why it is that leaves are so gorgeous that we will drive for hours to go look at the beautiful colored leaves. But then the minute they hit the ground, we got to get them out of there. Yes, they do eventually turn brown, but they also eventually get crunchy and crispy and they fall apart and break down and go away. This has been multiple years that leaves have never been raked up around here or mulched with a mower. I do confess that in the areas that I want to have retain some green, just because the dogs will make it into mud if it's not, I will reseed in the spring. But reseeding, going out there with a little sling of tossing out some grass seed is way easier than trying to suck up all these leaves and put them in bags. So again, we talk about it's not nice and neat and tidy. Well, this is nice and neat and tidy, but it's pretty boring and it's pretty pedestrian. It's going to be every single house pretty much has that same type of look to it. This is a very high-end home, you can tell, and it has very sharp curvature. Those angles are nice and probably could cut something. But other than shelter for some birds or creatures that are hiding maybe from a hawk or something, it doesn't provide any life. And at least to my eye, the aesthetic of this is kind of lost on me. It's the eyes of, say, some birds flying across the top or some butterflies or some bees. This is what it looks like to them, because there's no place for them to stop and take a rest other than if they don't need to also get a drink, buy a soda, fill up your teacup, go through the drive-through, or go to a sit-down dinner and at least get out of the car for that long, which is what we would do if we humans were stopping for an overnight. But it's a food desert to them. This is messy, but look at all the different blooms in there. You cannot imagine the amount of life that utilizes this one bed. It's labeled so that people will know that it's probably 97% of the plants in here are native plants. There is a plant of daisies. There are some surprise lilies in this bed, and there's a couple of just plain old short blue salvia, the annuals, not the native plant, but it has color and movement and texture and so much life in it. And it's surrounded by mown turf grass. So it shows that there is a purpose to these plants. It's not just a place that didn't get mowed. It's not just a place that somebody isn't taking care of things. So if you can utilize like one area and let it be messy, it'll be okay. because the other stuff doesn't necessarily look a whole lot neater and tidier than that once it's been in place for a couple of years. This is it in the fall. This is the Cuphea. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Cuphea. It's an annual, but it reseeds, and the color on the foliage is just spectacular in the fall. This is another area that if you have enough space, not everybody can do this, but if you've got even like a 10 by 5 foot space where you could seed in a whole bunch of packets of wildflower seed that you know came from the right place, so it's appropriate to your location, and mow around it. This, for me, I call this my mini prairie because I'm in an area where I have houses all around me. It's no way I could ever burn. And there's so many invasive trees from all the different Bradford pears that I'd never get them all out without burning. So could something like this be something you could allow to have just one spot in your yard? It doesn't have to be the whole yard. It could be something where you do something like this, put a birdhouse in there, put some ironwork for a vine to grow, do something that shows the neighbors this is an area that's for the birds or for the insects or both. And it's not something that has to be looked at only as unkempt. It can also show that it's there for a purpose. Do you have an outbuilding of any size that you could allow some things to be a little less tame right around the edges of it? Many people have sheds or barns or something where you could at least start small and just put a few things in. This is elderberry, which first you get the wonderful aroma of the blooms and millions of insects on it. Then you get the berries and the fall color, and it's just a great plant if you have room for it, because it can be kind of aggressive. Coreopsis over here, all kinds of different things that you can just let be crowded together. Let them do what Mother Nature would do if we weren't interfering by putting wide swaths of mulch in between every plant. These plants are super happy together. We've got the Echinacea, the purple coneflower, some little blue stem. There's some prairie drop seed in there. And then we've got Illinois bundleflower. And as you can see, there's a few of the little blossoms that you can still see there. But for me, I love the texture of the foliage. I love the texture of the seed heads. It's a really nice plant. So another thing that we might want to think about is Doug Tallamy, everybody should genuflect at that name too, has proposed that so that our native plants that we love so much can be more acceptable to those who are just beginning to learn, instead of calling this butterfly weed, we will rename it and call it Monarch's Delight. So for me, one of the things I'm thinking along those same lines is, instead of calling insects and caterpillars pests, perhaps we should call them consumers of our plants. These are walnut moths that totally defoliated this little baby walnut tree that I have. And I was like, oh boy, maybe I went too far this time. I mean, they ate every single leaf. It came right back. These are the milkweed tussock moths. Everybody freaks out because they eat the foliage before the monarchs get there, but notice I said before the monarchs get there. So usually there's time for it to regrow some foliage. And then this is one of those little caterpillars that they're so cute. They're inchworms is one of the common names for them. And they take little pieces of petals of all different flowers to disguise themselves as they creep across there. So what better camouflage? If we're going to raise native plants and we want to attract the insects and we want to attract the birds that come and consume those insects and help them to be healthy and happy in their habitat that we have created for them, again, sometimes I think that we try to overmanage our plantings. We as gardeners are so ingrained in our brains that we have to have straight rows and we have to do the fall cleanup. And there shouldn't be leaves on the ground and wide swaths of mulch, when Mother Nature doesn't intend those things to be how her plants grow. So kind of throwing back to that phrase of what would Jesus do? How about sometimes we think about what would Mother Nature do? Sometimes we have plants that we planted and they get eaten by rabbits and deer, and it's just so frustrating. And I tell people, you know what? If the roots are still in the ground, the plant will grow back. It's the roots that we planted. The foliage is almost irrelevant unless it's consistently eaten off until the roots die. So these plants are used to that. They've evolved together with all the creatures that we've eliminated several of already. And if we can live with this as our definition of neat and tidy, could we perhaps let Mother Nature mix in some asters where we had planted goldenrod, rather than thinking, well, that's where the goldenrod lives, and therefore I need to eliminate anything that's not the goldenrod, or vice versa. Sometimes it's okay. I mean, plants are meant to touch each other. So it's okay to let things evolve and move. For me, the whole evolution of this idea of the swaths of native plants, they are beautiful. But to me, that is going to take a whole lot of maintenance, because if you have a purple coneflower pop up where it's supposed to only be little blue stem, then you got to get in there and pull that purple coneflower. Otherwise, you could just say, oh, Mother Nature thinks that looks good together, and decide that you enjoy it instead of having to go out in the heat and pull it out. Another kind of idea that I've toyed with in the last several presentations that I've given, this is a really, really popular symbol right now. This is, you know, that dandelion blowing the seeds off the dandelion when you make a wish. And how many kids are actually ever able to do that anymore? If the only thing allowed where our lawns are is turf grass, and we have to kill every single weed. I mean, if you watch those commercials, they will tell you, if you have one weed in your yard, you are the bane of the neighborhood. And no, dandelions are not native, but they are completely edible for humans if you end up, you know, running out of salad as well as toilet paper. But the thing is, it's kind of a representation for us. You know, people who knew the massive herds of bison that roamed our country, they knew to miss them. People now really don't know what they're missing. And I think we might be raising some children who will never know what they're missing. This is my little garden helper. She is the absolute light of my life, if you haven't figured that out already. But I don't have to worry about there being a chemical anywhere in our yard that will harm her. Is there poison ivy? Yes, but we can deal with that. Everything else, she can walk barefoot, she can roll in the grass. I don't have to worry that there's some chemical on there that maybe would get into her little soft skin. Another reason that I want to have a happy, healthy habitat is for her. I want her to know what is missing if she grows up in a world where some of these things are eliminated. This is the final slide. It reminds you that Grow Native is a program of the Missouri Prairie Foundation, that they do incredible, wonderful, terrific work. I always encourage people, if you are able, please support them monetarily or with hours of volunteerism if you're not. And then what I have done, this is kind of different from what I've ever done, and I know I'm probably talking way too long, but I put a whole bunch of slides on here that are after this, because I knew it was going to be posted online where you could go look through them if you wanted to. But I want you to see some of the things that you will find if you create that healthy, happy habitat. You will find these things in your home. Would you notice this little guy, bright green monarch chrysalis there, if you were out here cutting down the seed heads? So I'll kind of flip through some of these slides maybe as we're answering questions, but they'll be out there. It's just some little things that, again, would you notice that guy if he were in the leaves and you were going to rake him up and leave him in the place he needed to be to overwinter? Probably not. Something for thinking about and to enjoy, I hope. That's the end, Brooke. Tell me what I need to do next.
Paula, this is Carol. Carol David, I'm the Executive Director of the Missouri Prairie Foundation. Paula, that was wonderful. We do have a number of questions. So I will ask you the questions, and there are a number of questions people had of some identification of some of the slides you showed earlier. So
Okay.
and if you can just answer questions until you, for as long as you can, that would be wonderful. So I'll just start in with the questions.
Okay.
There was a question early on about the mulch that you used in some of your photos, and it looked to me like the pine needles that I know you favor. Could you talk a little bit about that, about that, please?
Well, the mulch that I have gotten to the point that it's the only kind I will use is pine straw. Originally, it didn't come wrapped in plastic. It came baled just like a bale of straw does. But when you use it, it binds together just kind of like plant roots will do. And so it stays in place really well, even on inclines, even in windy spaces. And it also never gets really compacted. It stays fluffy and airy. So you can put a whole bunch of it around a new baby tree to help hold the moisture in, but it's never going to suffocate it because that air still moves through. It's lightweight. It weighs way less than a bale of straw does. And it's a fairly renewable type of thing. The issue I have with, for instance, cypress mulch is that I learned that they cut down living cypress trees to make that mulch with, which I cannot fathom. And when you use the free tree debris, that would be awesome. My concern is I don't always know if those trees had a disease or something. So this seems to me to be a decent alternative. You know, ideally, we only use it for the first 3 seasons, and after that, you will have ground cover that will have become your green mulch and filled in between the plants. But in the aesthetic world of many of the subdivisions and HOAs and restrictive areas, and in the mind of our neighbors, they expect to see mulch. And a lot of times it's that evolution over that 3-year period that actually makes that more acceptable to them as well, that they start off seeing, okay, this is traditional, it's got the mulch, the plants are in there. And then over time, they begin to touch each other. So that's kind of the whole story on pine straw.
Thank you, Paul. And that's a really good point about letting the air in. There's another question, if you don't mind, Paul, I wanted to answer it just real quick because other people might have a similar question. Someone asked where they can buy native plants in St. Louis. And if you go to grownative.org and go to resource guide, click on that, and we have a Google Earth map showing the locations of native plant retailers who are Grow Native professional members. And then you can also find really comprehensive information on all the products and services of all of our professional members, like Paula, who is a professional member. So I just wanted to mention that real quick in case anybody else had a similar question, and we'll send out that link tomorrow as well. Paula, there was a question here about, do neonics in dog collars have impact on native insects, or is the effect localized to the dogs?
Well, interestingly enough, where did I read that recently? It wasn't in the Prairie Journal, was it, Carol?
I don't think so, but I did.
Recently, I've read, and I mean like within the last couple of weeks, it mentioned that in fact, the dog collars do have an impact. I mean, this is not something I have any personal knowledge of whatsoever, so please don't expect me to know that. But there was an article I read sometime really recently that discussed that it does in fact impact the insects as the dogs go past them. So I think that's kind of another one of those things where we haven't thought about, you know, we think inside of our box and we haven't thought about what happens outside of our box if we're pushing on that cardboard or something. I mean, there's my analogy, but anyway, yeah, there is some kind of connection that I've read about recently.
Thanks, Paula. And I had 2 bits of information too on this. And of course, I'm not an expert. I don't have a dog, and I'm sure there are many, many different kinds of chemicals and many different kinds of dog collars. But I know that Dr. Chip Taylor of Monarch Watch has mentioned that yes, chemicals in at least some dog collars can affect other organisms. And a friend of mine, colleague Nathadel Powathong, who's a wildlife photographer, has milkweed planted along his sidewalk and has a dog with a collar, and noticed the monarch caterpillars died, and then realized that his dog was brushing past those plants.
Wow.
Yeah, so again, I can't say all dog collars. I'm sure there's a great variety, but it is a reminder, as Paula said, to just be mindful of the kinds of chemicals we use in many facets of our lives. Let's see, there was a question here from Emily. I have an area that I can create similar to Paula's quote, Little Prairie. So I'd love to know what those two flowers were. There was a taller white one and a shorter yellow one.
The white was probably just the daisy fleabane type of aster. And the yellow was one of the tall coreopsis. I really don't remember which ones were in the seed mix that I threw out. But I threw it all out all over the yard when we first moved in, thinking, okay, I'll be able to burn here and I can have my prairie. And then I realized, no, that was wrong. So.
Okay, thank you. Question here from Nancy. What ground covers does Paula recommend?
Well, we need a little more information on that. Again, go to the Grow Native website and they have wonderful resource guides. And I believe there's one specifically for ground covers, as I recall, and perhaps even one that differentiates between sun and shade, because that makes a huge difference. Is it dry? Is it wet? Is it sunny? Is it shady? That's going to make a huge difference in what you can choose.
Thanks, Paula. And Nancy, if you're still here, if you want to type back a little more detail, and just to add a bit to what Paula was saying, also on the Grow Native website, you can go to the native plant database, and you can, we have a searchable database of over 300 native plants, and there's one category called special usage. Click on ground cover, and then if you have sunny area, click on sun, or if you have shade, click on shade, and that will narrow down a list for you. And we do have a top 10 list as well, and a little video about natives for dry shade if you happen to have dry shade. So we'll share all those things for you. But Nancy, if you are still here with us, if you want to email us back a little more info, and I'm sure Paula will have some great ideas for you. Let's see. There were a few other questions. Let's see, some questions about some other plants that you had. And maybe just as you're scrolling through these, Paula, if you have any, maybe you could just ID some of these plants in addition to the insects that you've got highlighted. I think people are real keen to know some of the, and you did name obviously quite a few of the plants, but maybe as you're going through on these additional slides, if you could just name the plants.
Well, and also if anybody has questions on them, they're welcome to email me with them later on. I won't guarantee how quickly I will get back to you, but I will get back to you. This one, the circle is drawn around a hummingbird that was there for some skullcap, which is in front of the goldenrod. Skullcap is so pretty, and the seed head is so pretty after the bloom is done too. But he just surprised me when I was standing there taking pictures of other things that day, and I was surprised with as small as those blossoms are that the hummingbird was there. And luckily got a little bit of a shot of him.
That's cool. Janet has a question. I plant milkweed at the front door, which faces northeast. Tussock moths devour it nearly every year. Monarchs are on our roadside banks, but not near the house. Any suggestions?
When you say northeast, it makes me wonder if it's in shade for a good deal of the day. The monarchs are always going to choose the sunnier areas unless it's particularly windy. In my experience, they're going to go in the sun because that's how they stay warm. They can't maintain their own temperature. And the tussock moths, they seem to be much more adaptable to many different places. I find them all over the place. If you have too many tussock moths, you could relocate a few out to the other milkweed that you have, perhaps. But typically the monarchs are going to head for the sun in my experience.
Thanks, Paula. Here's another little follow-up about the dog collars. Robin was asking about the reference. And Robin, what I told you was told to me just verbally from Dr. Taylor and my colleague, but so I don't have a reference, but I will do a little digging and we will send in the email tomorrow what we can find.
And to reiterate, Dr. Taylor is Dr. Chip Taylor from KU, where Monarch Watch is located, if you're not familiar with that already.
Is it a question from Chelsea? Is it too late to prep ground for a seed mix this year? And what all goes into that process?
Well, that's a pretty complicated answer to give. It's going to depend on what's there right now. You know, is it just turf grass? Is it a hedgerow that has to be eliminated? Are you talking about 20 acres or are you talking about a 5x5 space? If we're going to talk about, you know, traditional gardening, and so you're just creating a bed, if there's nothing there really as far as like English ivy or vinca or any of the invasive things, go ahead and put the cardboard over the area now. You want non-slick cardboard so that it's still permeable for the water to get through, but you want to overlap your edges a good 6 to 8 inches. That way you prevent any sunshine from getting in there and photosynthesis to happen. Usually that's a pretty good start for it. It'll just kind of start to decompose everything that's underneath it throughout the winter time.
Paula, Chelsea gave a little bit more information. She says she's got patchy turf grass in a traditional backyard.
Then absolutely go for it. It shouldn't be an issue.
And Paula, this is just me as a follow-up, maybe to try to help Chelsea. If she can get that turf grass, you think she can get that killed here in the next soon? And then, because she could, if she's got.
Yeah, if she's planting in spring, it will definitely set it back on its heels. And if I were doing that type of an installation, I would typically go ahead and put the cardboard down now if you know your space ahead of time. And then in the springtime, you can just cut a hole in the cardboard where you're going to put individual plant instead of like removing it all and then redoing it. Cut a hole in cardboard, stick your plant in, pull out any grass that's poking out there where you cut the hole, you know, give it a little bit of extra space so it can grow a little bit wider throughout the summer. And that cardboard will begin its decomposition process. So once you get all your plants in, cover it back over with mulch or leaves or whatever you're going to use for your top dressing. And that cardboard will actually decompose and go away eventually on its own, and it'll kill the grass as it does so, because it won't be able to photosynthesize. So that's why your overlapping edges is really important.
Thanks, Paula. And Chelsea she says for a seed mix. So could she?
Oh, for a seed mix. Give it a shot. I mean, what's the worst thing that could happen? You have to leave it a little bit longer and start a little bit later. But if it's patchy to begin with, it's probably going to be ready to die. It's not thriving, so it will be glad to be able to not have to struggle anymore.
And Chelsea, we'll send you also a link to an article. It's about planting a larger seeded area, but it still might help give you some tips too for what you want to do. So we'll send that along too. Question from Nancy. Nancy's back. Nancy, the ground cover. She says she's got a sunny, this is the ground cover question. I have a sunny slope that is currently growing a lot of quote weeds between the black-eyed Susan sprouts I put in. So it sounds like she's got a sunny slope and looking for ground cover.
Again, we don't know if we need to worry about soil erosion or things like that. I mean, pussy toes are always a terrific ground cover and they're really adaptable. It sounds like you've got some black-eyed Susans already going. Purple poppy mallow, if you're not expecting it to hold your soil for an erosion issue, is a terrific ground cover in a sunny spot like that. If it's hard to access, you get a couple of purple poppy mallows in there and then just let them do their thing over the next few years. What else would be good? Rose verbena is always good in the sun. Missouri evening primrose. There's so many to choose from. I mean, sometimes it can be a matter of what colors are your favorites or which insect do you want to attract. And even some of the taller things like a penstemon, the body of the foliage stays pretty close to the ground, and it's a pretty good one to fill in between some that bloom at a different time.
Thanks, Paula. Question from Emily about your pocket prairie. Paula, did you broadcast seed in the fall or winter? If so, I'm curious how you prepared your site prior to tossing out native seed.
Well, me being me and letting Mother Nature do her thing, we bought this property 5 years ago, and it was just mowed turf grass to everybody that had been here prior to me. And so at some point during that first summer, I don't even remember when, I bought a pound or so of seed and just threw it everywhere using my hands. And I figured, you know, some portion of it's going to hit the soil below the grass, and it'll eventually germinate and it'll eventually grow. And so by this year, I had some stands that I was able to let some patches do their thing. So I'm not a good one to ask on how do you do these specific preparations, because a lot of times I just say, let Mother Nature do it.
Thanks, Paula. Another question about, from Nancy, I had quite a few monarch caterpillars and chrysalises, but very few emerged. They turned dark and almost melted. Any idea why?
Yep, that sounds like a tachinid wasp laid eggs and got into them. It's another part of Mother Nature doing her thing. So many of us started our interest in this whole environment because of the monarchs. And then we have to learn that, well, you know, we love the monarchs, but we also need the tussock moths for the birds to eat them. And the whole purpose of them is really not for our personal enjoyment, no matter how much enjoyment it gives us. Their purpose is actually to be a food source for some other creature. And so, in all likelihood, they were a food source for another creature or its larvae.
Thank you, Paula. Oops, sorry. Let me get back to my screen here. Just looking for questions on Facebook as well. I think I've got that's all the questions here from folks. I did want to mention something. I know, Paula, from a presentation you gave before for us, something that I thought was very useful, and folks here might want to know is you had a slide. You were talking about some horticulture practices like trimming the phlox. I think you had a really great photo of that, and wondered if you could talk just a little bit about some of those kind of horticulture practices if you do want to try to make things a little more compact.
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of these plants evolved being a food source as well as being a food source for the insects. They were food sources for larger creatures too. So if we accidentally, in my husband's case, or intentionally in my own case, give them a trim occasionally, usually things can survive it. If you want to manage for the aesthetic factor, there are several different plants. Usually I tell people July 4th as your cutoff date, just because that's an easy date to remember. You know, if you do it July 15th, it's not going to make a huge difference, but most of the plants that bloom later that sometimes get a bit leggy, or if they have bloomed really early and they're getting leggy, the thing is, if you trim the early bloomers, then you're going to miss out on the seeds. But the later bloomers, such as New England aster, can get, 6 feet tall if it's really happy. But if you need it to only be 3 feet tall, then just whack it back. And if it grows again to where it's 5 feet tall and you whack it back again, it will still bloom by the end of the season if you stop somewhere at the beginning of July-ish.
Thank you, Paula. I think that is all the questions. But if, as Paula generously offered if you have other questions. So if Paula, you don't mind if we share your
I
email,
don't mind at
send
all.
out tomorrow. So everyone, you can look for an email from Brooke tomorrow with some other resources that have been mentioned here today. And again, Paula's presentation has been recorded, so you can go back and view it. And do check back with us. We have one more, we have a master class next Wednesday, and then we are just putting the finishing touches on webinars and master classes for January and February, and then we'll have them into March as well. So we'll get that information out to everyone as soon as we can as well. Thank you everyone for tuning in. And Paula, thank you. It was a wonderful, wonderful presentation.
Thank you all. Enjoy.
Bye-bye.